when you talk about those kind of structural impediments, so firsthand, people are going to say, well, sure, we understand that money corrupts, but we expected more of these squad members because they campaigned on not taking corporate money. They are grassroots funded. So what's their excuse? Okay. And then you bring up this other piece that's about the power all being concentrated in House leadership, which is now Hakeem Jefferies, which is a whole other story that I'd love to ask you about. But let's just stay with the Nancy Pelosi example for a second. And that perhaps gives some air to arguments that say the following. The squad members have limited power. They are an extreme minority. They're up against powerful figures like Nancy Pelosi. It's good for them to actually keep their head down and try to wrangle for more prestigious committee appointments so that they can slowly build power the way that folks like Pelosi have done over the years, and then they can act. You know, I have had many a disagreement back and forth about the utility of that kind of approach and whether or not it could actually be successful, partly because we see that people like Pramila Jayapal, who's very openly taken that kind of approach, got completely passed over for this speaker position, doesn't seem to have really any genuine shot at leadership, despite being behind some of the more dastardly moments of the past year with the bifurcation of the Build Back Better bill, convincing the progressives not to hold the line over a $15 minimum wage, and now doing this wrangling with the TA where she joined it with the 7-day sick leave bill so that she could basically provide cover for folks to vote for this thing and get it into the Senate, where, of course, it was going to be decoupled and the 7 days were going to get voted down. So I guess that's a long way of asking, what do you think of what do you think of the logic of those progressives who say, I understand why progressive electeds are keeping their head down and just playing the long game?
Well, the long game keeps becoming longer. I mean, how many years do you have to wait for universal health insurance? President Harry Truman proposed it in the 1940s. How many years do you have to wait for an increase of minimum wage from the paltry $7.25 an hour federal before it goes to $15 an hour and improves the wages of 25 million workers? Quite a few of them would vote just on that issue enough. And just say, go vote for a raise. It's long overdue and you've earned it. It's lucky you're not getting back pay for being cheated. So the argument is absurd on the evidence. The progressives get nothing by going along. They get nothing. I'll give you an example. There were 32 members of the Freedom Caucus on the Republican side. They dominated Speaker Boehner. They basically said, don't mess with us. Here are our demands. If you don't accept our demands, we're pulling the plug on you. 32 votes. Well, there are a lot more than that progressive votes on the Democratic side. But, Pelosi is a genius at dividing and ruling, and she's a genius at punishing. And what the progressives have failed to understand is they're going there to serve the people. There's nothing else they should demand. No special assignments and this and that. They get these special assignments and they do nothing. Nothing. I mean, what have they done in terms of getting hearings, long overdue hearings, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, using the opportunity of Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates, which have never been given a voice at a congressional hearing in the last 60 years? They do nothing. What have they done on Social Security by getting on these committees? Nothing. What have they done on living wage? Nothing. What have they done on upgrading the federal corporate criminal law code, which is obsolete and ridiculous in terms of equipping enough federal cops on the corporate crime beat? Nothing. Not only don't they get anything, they don't even put the bills in most times. So you can have a bill number and go out, citizen groups go out around the country rallying around the bill number. That's a totally repudiated argument. It doesn't hold water, and it's a disgrace that they would even try to float that idea. The only way they can get anything is to say no, and we're withdrawing our votes, and then go to the table and negotiate with the corporate Democrats. And the corporate Democrats know that the margin with the Republicans over recent years has been quite narrow, and that these progressives could be as powerful, if not more so, than the so-called Freedom Caucus, I call it the corporate caucus, in the House of Representatives. I mean, Boehner basically quit, and he blamed those 32 members of his caucus.
Yeah, well, it has been fascinating to watch Republicans put up some fight over their speaker. After all of the pushback we saw around the force the vote moment 2 years ago, where Democrats, rested at their clothes and pulled out their hair, claiming that, if the progressives were to withhold their votes for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House for any concession at all, or simply just to make her not Speaker of the House, that the consequences would be dire. The things that they said were that somehow we would get Kevin McCarthy, a Republican Speaker of the House, which was impossible unless Democrats were to have actually voted for Kevin McCarthy. Now, of course, Kevin McCarthy is in all likelihood going to be Speaker of the House. And at the same time, the other excuse that they gave was, oh, well, if it's not Nancy Pelosi, it will be Hakeem Jefferies, and he might even be worse. Now, of course, Hakeem Jeffries is going to be my minority leader. So I want to ask you, you just brought up Israel-Palestine as an issue, for example. Hakeem Jeffries is someone who has described Israel as New York's 6th district.
Someone said to me, they said, Hakeem, you're going to Israel a 5th time? I said, listen, I'm from New York City. And back home in New York City, we consider Jerusalem to be the 6th borough.
What do you make of him and how this is going to change the dynamics and the possibilities for progressives to use any kind of leverage in the House at all?
Well, all you have to do is look at the evolution of the Congressional Black Caucus. When I was at law school, the same law school you went to, it was at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Orville Faubus was governor of Arkansas, and a few of us would go to rallies and demonstrate. And at night, we'd go to a restaurant, and we'd start dreaming. And we'd say, the only way Negroes were going to get power in this country, that's what they were called in those days, as you know. The only way they were going to get power was politically, that they have to elect members of the House and Senate and start getting seniority and getting power. Well, the corporations had another design. The Congressional Black Caucus is so immersed in corporate contributions and corporate wining and dining and all the rest of the political influence that operates on Capitol Hill, that it was exposed even in the New York Times in 2011 by Eric Lipton, and in an article in the Capitol Hill Citizen, which is a new pilot newspaper that we're starting, and Hakeem Jefferies comes out of that environment. You have senior black legislators who at various times controlled the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Judiciary Committee. I mean, these are powerful committees, and they would never do any investigation of commercial exploitation in the ghettos, in the inner city. I would go and ask them, and they would never do it. I had to get Dennis Kucinich, who had a subcommittee that wasn't a legislative subcommittee, to have 2 or 3 days of hearings. Now, Hakeem Jefferies, unknown to most people, has had a very radical uncle. I mean, he was a very fundamental advocate for economic justice, and it didn't rub off. And what happens with these what happens with these minority members of Congress is they're rewarded only if they get along, only if they answer the question no when asked, "Are you going to give corporate power trouble?" If they say no, they start being given the next rung of the ladder and the next rung of the ladder. So Hakeem Jeffries knows what the score is. He knows what the power distribution is in this country. He knows the inequalities and the exploitation. But he also knows that if he wants to be an influential member of the House, he has to get along by going along the likes of the circle around Nancy Pelosi.
I mean, look at Maxine Waters chairing the Financial Services Committee. The news last week was that she wasn't going to subpoena Sam Bankman-Fried post, as the complete collapse of his crypto exchange to come and testify. Now, they say it's because he's going to do so voluntarily. We'll see what happens. But some people read into that a certain sympathy there. He's a prolific Democratic Party donor. Of course, he's donated to both parties because that's what they do. So no matter who wins, their regulatory regime is the one that's put into place. But Maxine Waters, someone who has been celebrated in the mainstream media sphere as being a kind of a liberal or a progressive person, partly for kind of these identity politics, representational politics reasons, partly because she, said some good progressive things around the defund the police movement and the protests around 2020, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look any closer, you see her doing things like apparently being the mastermind behind excluding Katie Porter from the Financial Services Committee, exactly because Katie Porter was drawing too much attention to financial inequity and advocating for things like a wealth tax and things that upset the people on the committee who are real fundraising powerhouses for the Democratic Party.
Well, that's another example you gave. Maxine Waters ascended to the chair of the Powerful Banking Committee, it was called in those days, which was traditionally, after Texas Congressman Wright Patman left, he was a tough antagonist of the banking industry, that was just totally controlled by the banking lobbyists from Wall Street. And so when she became chair, a lot of us said, well, she's been keeping her own counsel, climbing the ladder up there to the chair, but now we really have a progressive Democrat and things are going to change, and she's from a completely safe seat in Southern California. Has nothing to worry about in terms of reelection. And what happened? Who knows what happened? The media covering the Congress doesn't dig into those things. They just do official source journalism. I have no idea what happened to her. It's stunning. She doesn't hold the hearings we all expected. You mentioned the wealth tax hearing. But there are a lot of other things about concentration of banking, ripping off consumers, mortgage discrimination, redlining, on and on. There's no end to the corruption of banks. And by the way, in 2008, Brianna, there was a poll, 2009, I think it was. There was a poll. Do you favor breaking up the big banks in New York? 90% of the people came in. So it's not like she doesn't have public opinion on her side, but she's part of the Congressional Black Caucus. And here we go again. So this is what happens when people do not organize back home. There's no organization back in her district summoning her to town meeting with the people's own agenda about how banks are not investing or disinvesting or ripping off people or charging too much for bounce checks and all the rest. There's nothing like that summoning her to a town meeting in a public auditorium where she sits and listens to the people and they send her instructions on her way back to Washington. That's where the problem starts. Well, and that's what we have to focus on.
Can you walk us through what that starts to look like and how people start to achieve that? Because I do think there's a real recognition that that's what's required. But there is a sense of overwhelm when you see how impossible it is to do that, seemingly, even with the progressive members of the squad. So, for example, I don't know if you heard that, but part of the fallout over the votes over this railroad TA has been conversation in DSA about whether to kick Jamal Bowman or some of the other squad members out over their vote. And there was a similar kind of sanctions conversation back when over, I think, one of these Iron Dome funding votes that also centered on Jamal Bowman. And yet nothing comes of it. I think there is a lot of appetite for it, frankly, among kind of rank and file DSA members. But whoever attends the meetings, whenever these votes come down, nothing ends up happening. And so if we can't even get self-described socialists to, on some level, give a nod to the progressive movement to be accountable in any way, what does it look like to start to try to hold these non-progressive Congress members accountable, especially when you look at examples like even Shahid Buttar, who ran one of the only real challenges to Nancy Pelosi in her 30-odd years in Congress and was completely bulldozed, frankly, largely ignored by even the progressive community, and then hit with a smear campaign from the Pelosi's that was ultimately very effective.
Well, it comes back to what I've called about the lowest level of civic activity back home in 60 years. It's half a democracy showing up, Brianna. We all know that. Showing up for marches, demonstrations, town hall meetings, city council meetings, neighborhood gatherings, developing strategy is nothing. It's this iPhone. It's this tablet. They've been abducted into the internet gulag run by these corporate wardens out of Silicon Valley, and they start at a very young age. So we have to start with something very simple. 20 people in a congressional district, they print a letterhead, and they basically say, Congress Watchdog, 23rd District, whatever, California, with the name of the member and the 2 senators. And they float it. And they basically say, who wants to join? And when you get 500, that will get you the visit by a member of the House of Representatives. That's how little it takes. 500 members, 500 citizens on a petition with their name legible, their occupation legible, and their contact information. So it isn't just some corner petition where someone scribbles their name, nobody can read it. If you have 1,000 names on a petition, you'll get a senator coming to your town meeting. People don't understand that. They think, you have to get tens of thousands. There's so little organization back home that level of organization starts scaring the members. They say, well, we've never had 500 clear signatures asking us to come to a town meeting and discuss the people's agenda. So instead of focusing on the end game, which is 535 members of Congress that have the sovereign power delegated to them under the Constitution, you start with the people back home, and you'll see the sparks coming. You'll see the signals. You'll see the yellow lights blinking over Congress when that happens. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen years ago. You've read about it in the civil rights movement, environment, women's rights. There's never more than 1% of the people who know what they're talking about, are determined, are advancing causes supported by a majority of the people that can be defeated in Congress no matter how many corporations swarm the area. Less than 1%. That's 2.5 million adults in 435 districts. But when you start talking about it, the interviewer immediately changes the subject and starts talking about the politicians and the big money. Well, the politicians don't want money except to get votes. But if the voters cut the money off at the pass, if they start conditioning their votes, it doesn't matter how much money they raise in Congress because it's not getting them the votes. The voters are too informed. They nullify the money. But you start talking about this, and I've done hundreds of interviews like this. The interviewer never wants to extend. Oh, well, how are you actually organized? How does it get started? What's the nature of the town meeting? On and on. No, they go right back to the political arguments.
Well, it's because I guess I have that instinct as well, Ralph. And it's because I think in part, I'm wondering if the fact of unlimited political spending, the world that we live in today, the ability to fundraise untold amounts from corporate donors and without really needing to rely on, donations from the people at all. And the fact of the media environment that we live in, which has such an overpowering effect, means that what you're describing is still possible. I'm not saying it's not at all. I'm just trying to work through in my brain, whether or not, even if we did get 500, 1,000, 3,000 signatures, whether that would honestly compel someone like Maxine Waters or someone like Hakeem Jefferies or someone like Chuck Schumer to actually show up at a town meeting.
Well, first of all, they have to be elected in a relatively small district of no more than 750,000 people, including children. That's their main concern. It's not the whole country. So the leverage of a few hundred voters who are determined is accentuated because of that population context I just mentioned. The second thing they're afraid of is anything that's growing. I always tell people when I urge them to write their members of Congress, is you always have to have a P.S. at the end of the letter. You say, I'm just one person signing this letter, Senator or Representative, but, if you want me to get 30 more signatures or even 60, no problem, just let me know.
Mm.
You see, that gives that letter much more force than if it was just signed by one or two people. So the members of Congress have very sensitive antenna. And if they see something is starting and it's starting to grow and it has left-right support, like so many of these issues do, if we would only pay less attention to the divide and rule tactics of the ruling classes, which they've been engaged in for over 2,000 years, they start paying serious attention. See, I'm not just talking theory here. I'm not just talking like two Harvard professors on how democracies die. I'm talking from experience. It really makes it. And they have this rule of thumb years ago in Congress. If somebody complains about an issue, that they automatically think that at least 20, 25 people have the same viewpoint, but they just didn't bother to complain. Well, people ought to try it. Give it a try. Listen, there's far more energy and time put into bridge contests, playing bridge. I've often said, if we had as many people watching Congress as there are bird watchers, Congress would be so populous you wouldn't know how to spell the word. It would be so every door. There are 15 million bird watchers, and I don't know whether there's even 500 Congress watchers in the country.
I really do like the idea of a kind of congressional watchers. It's very appealing to me. In fact, one of my favorite political podcasts by Jen Briney, I like so much because her episodes don't come out as frequently, but she is like a human C-SPAN. She just sits there and reads the congressional record and like puts her eyes on every document and does real reporting on what's going on. And it is an empowering thing to do, but so few people feel like they have the bandwidth or even the kind of expertise, as it will, to be qualified to do something like that. And I admired her very much because she's doing it as kind of a civilian journalist, and she's very, very good at it. So I'm going to sit with that. And I know many people listen to this show. Just last night on a call-in show that I do, they were agitating, saying, well, what do we do next? How can we organize ourselves? We are tired of just sitting around talking about it. And that resonates with me. And I think it is time in the context of this and the trajectory of this podcast and the trajectory of this movement to start trying to put together some mechanisms, a Slack channel, something for people who all listen and have these ideas and want to participate, to get together to try to coordinate actions like the ones you're describing with other members of their own states. Yeah.
Once the media sees a pulse out there among the people, they start reporting it. Once they see a pulse and once they see it's growing. When we started taking on the auto industry in the 1960s, I went up on Capitol Hill and they laughed at me. Are you kidding? You're going to take on GM? You're going to take on Goodyear? And I said, well, we certainly have the evidence that they're not producing safe cars and safe tires, and they're suppressing this innovation and selling power, horsepower, and style. Let's say, well, you better get real. So listen to the end game. In less than a year, with less than 1,000 people around the country, part-time, supporting us, the highway and auto safety bills were passed unanimously in the Senate and House and sent to Lyndon Johnson for his signature, September 1966.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.